Primavera, if you could come to the stage to moderate Primavera. Juan, Simon, Mathijs, Trent, if you could come up on stage. And this is smart contracts and alternative IP systems. And is Mathijs here? Koenraadt, I don't know if I got that right. Who is the philosopher? Is he?
Trent was around here.
Trent was actually at the back, sitting here somewhere. Maybe he's in his bio.
He might be outside. 1 second.
Yeah, you will find him.
And Mathijs.
Yes, yes. So am I. We are all Mathijs. Yeah. Okay. So as we wait for him, Primavera, over to you. Could you provide some context here?
Okay. So this panel is about how the blockchain can support / complement / supplement intellectual property, whether we are talking about copyright or patents. So we analyze already on Sunday different possibilities of what are the different ways in which the blockchain can actually support the intellectual property model. I think the best is like if everyone can really shortlist. So everyone is actually a representative of one possibility in which the blockchain can be used. So perhaps everyone can introduce themselves for like 1 minute and presenting the project and what is the vision, and then we can move on.
All right. My name is Juan. I'm the creator of IPFS. I represent both the IPFS project in general and the Filecoin project, which is another protocol, and Protocol Labs, which is the company that is making both of these. When we think about how we hold property in general, it's really about records and keeping records that are auditable. Many people have discussed how this could be done on blockchains and so on. But when you think about the amount of data that you need to put in to these systems, it of course doesn't make sense to just put all of the raw data into the blockchain, right? So what we're working on is making systems around blockchains where you can put on all of the information around holding property. And this is not only IP, of course, this could be extending to other things. But it's mostly about creating sort of certified records, right? So records that indicate where, who holds what and so on, that are certified by important entities. And this translates to just a public key infrastructure with legal documents that are signed and can be verified by anyone, both publicly and privately. So you should be able to do this as part of public records that anybody can browse and audit, as well as private records that are encrypted and so on, and only revealed when necessary, and only revealed to certain parties. Where this gets interesting is how can you create a system that can address all of these records in such a way that no single party necessarily is the only one that has to hold them, right? So if you think about the web today and you were to put a document on the web, you would have to find a specific organization that will back up that data and serve the content, right? This is how HTTP works. You're talking to a specific organization. However, what we're making with IPFS is a system where it's content addressed, meaning that you can write down a string identifier based on a hash of what the content actually is. And so people can help seed that or not, but you can find it on the network without having to rely on any one party, right? So this completely decentralizes the idea of publishing information into the network. An entity can come in, publish data into the network, other people can back it up. There's of course incentives for backing it up depending on whether you pay them to or not, or there are of course some other reasons. But the important piece is that no single entity controls the relaying of that information, so that if an entity goes down for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. Other entities can help serve the same content, and all of the links are preserved, which is, I think, extremely critical when you think about maintaining all of these records, right? So there's tons of databases that go under and disappear, and this is a big issue when you think about maintaining property and legal records online on the network. So that's kind of the issues that we're thinking about and helping preserve, and we work with a whole bunch of different other systems like solutions on top of Bitcoin, solutions on top of Ethereum, and a bunch of other things. So,
yeah, I am Simon. I am a developer at Consensys. We build a bunch of decentralized applications primarily on top of Ethereum. One of the projects I worked on recently was a project called Ujo Music, and this was launched about 2 weeks ago, and we wanted to showcase that it's possible to use the blockchain to store rights and then also use it simultaneously to automatically settle and disperse payments. In the future, we plan to support more arbitrarily complex policies, but Ujo demonstrated that it's possible that an artist can, for example, put up their rights in a smart contract and then automatically have the percentages that they owe to their different collaborators or rights owners. And then when someone pays in Ether, then the amount is automatically dispersed to the separate participants when a person decides to buy the song, which is essentially a one-time license for non-commercial use. We eventually plan to make this a more extensive system to allow not only musicians, but also artwork, film, and so forth, provide this sort of transparent layer where the fans can see where the creatives' funds are going, then hopefully connect more personally, a more direct interaction between the creative and the money flow.
Hi there, I'm Trent McConaghy. I'm co-founder and CTO of Ascribe, which is a project I've been working on for about 2 years. In Ascribe, we're focusing on a fundamental challenge on the internet and beyond, but especially on the internet, and that is, if you're a creator, you're getting a raw deal. You put stuff onto the internet, and you're probably not going to get paid. At best, maybe you get a fraction of a cent for a YouTube view, and via ads, which is also like a horrible solution to monetization. So, and it's actually really bad for the collectors too. If you're a collector that's trying to collect digital art, how do you truly own the digital art? Or if you're a connector, you're SoundCloud and you don't deal with the legals, and suddenly you have the music labels down your back. So you're Spotify and they take their 5 pounds of flesh. So it's actually really hard for sort of the creators, the connectors, and the collectors all around. And the sort of fundamental problem is that the user experience, the UX for IP is broken. It's really hard to access IP. This legal system exists. It's been around in different shapes and forms for centuries, actually. But normally, you need to hire a lawyer, pay him $1,000, $5,000 to come up with a license to figure it out, and so that most people aren't even aware of it, right? We've met collectors who have bought a piece of digital art. They spend $30,000. They don't get a license. So we tell them that all they own is actually a piece of plastic, on a DVD, and they're near tears. But that's actually the reality. It's actually really sad. So the UX for IP is so broken that people don't even realize that it's a thing that exists. This idea that, roughly speaking, you can own ideas. It's actually the instantiation of the idea, but you can own ideas, and you can license them, you can sell them, etc. So the question is, what can you do about it, especially on the internet? And there's actually sort of 3 pillars to the solution. One of them is you first of all have to make it easy, right? So you need a user experience that makes it really easy for people to declare that to claim their copyright. So we focus on copyright because it's actually a bigger problem on the internet, and it's actually legally sort of simpler to approach. So to claim it, and that comes down to, for example, hashing a file on the blockchain, but making that easy. Lots of people do that part, right? But we tie it with claiming copyright. So when you use Ascribe and you upload your work and you type the title and name of the artist and so on, it's actually claiming copyright. But then once you do that, that's the easy part, and then you can license it to as easy as sending an email, right? That's really important. So just like starting with PayPal, but then with things like Stripe and so on, you could wire money as easy as sending an email, right? There's an API for all this ownership. So that's like payment processing. Think of this as ownership processing, ownership of IP, right? So you can literally send IP to someone else essentially by sending an email now, right? So easy legals, secure legals. So when these things happen, you can't, if you store it on a centralized database, like a SQL database or something, then what happens if that database goes away, right? So you need to decentralize this somehow, these different ownership transactions that happen. And that's where decentralized technology obviously comes and plays a big role, right? So we happen to use the Bitcoin blockchain right now. Soon we'll be using IPFS, I look forward to it as well. Overall though, it actually almost doesn't matter which database is used as long as no one owns it, no one controls it. As long as those transaction records, those timestamps of the licensing, et cetera, are stored out there. So that's the first part, is easy, secure legals, sort of part one, part two. There's a third part that's actually really essential too. And it's simply, we built these things in Ascribe. You know, we've been shipping this actually in beta form since last fall for more than a year, basically. And what we found was when we were working with digital artists, et cetera, they said, okay, this is great. I've got my stuff like legally secured, all that, but I'm still scared to put it on the internet because I don't know what's happening. I have no visibility. I feel like I've lost control. So they just don't bother, right? And you'll see this all the time, like for example, Shapeways, it's a 3D consumer, 3D printing company, and they have hardly any sort of content of value because people are scared to put their stuff up because as soon as they put it up, they lose control, right? And so what we do actually is we crawl the web. We basically solo the internet, identify all the similar images or 3D designs, et cetera, and we give that back to the designer as visibility. So it's sort of like X-ray for the web. And that's sort of the third part. And it's actually, there's sort of two sides of the ownership coin, right? There's the sort of easy, secure legals, and there's the visibility into what's going on, and they play back and forth with each other. So overall, that's what Ascribe is about, is ownership processing is one way. Another way is just saying to make the UX for IP easy and accessible. So that's what we do. And you know, our overall mission, I'll restate because it's super important to us, it's not about the blockchain. We don't even call ourselves actually a blockchain company. It's about the creators. It's about people creating things of value, putting them on the internet and getting paid for it in a way that matters.
Thank you. So I will actually abuse my position as a moderator to play the devil's advocate. So my first question is actually for Juan, but please feel free to jump in afterwards. It seems to me that IPFS is actually quite amazing in terms of providing distributed archival of any kind of content, digital content. But another thing that comes to my mind when you describe IPFS is that it's pretty much like a nice peer-to-peer file sharing network. So, you know, before going into how the blockchain can actually support or complement intellectual property, so as a completely decentralized platform, what kind of like, is there any kind of mechanism or how do you deal with the fact that obviously people might perfectly use IPFS for copyright infringement? Is there any kind of possible protection mechanism or models to actually prevent this and to actually protect copyright on IPFS, or do you just not want to deal with this and just delegate to the user what they are doing?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Like, what is the creator of a peer-to-peer file system doing in a copyright panel? So here's the thing. When you look at HTTP and how HTTP is actually used today, there's no inherent protection for copyright whatsoever. Anything that anyone can do with BitTorrent and with you know, all the other file sharing systems like Kazaa and Napster and so on, you can achieve with HTTP today, and even people constantly do it over Tor and so on. The whole piracy ecosystem exists and is widely, it's used by a large set of people, and it's out there, and it doesn't need any new tool. Like, new tools won't necessarily make it easier or harder and so on, in that they already have everything they need. HTTP plus Tor is good enough from a finding content perspective, right? What IPFS does around this is that you have to, it's a very tricky thing, right? Because at the same time, you want to protect people sharing content correctly according to the legal jurisdiction that they respect. I mean, when you think about it, copyright as well as code of conduct is a jurisdiction-based thing, right? Think about like the DMCA as an international treaty that everyone kind of follows, but you think about other types of things like laws around what is okay or not okay to publish, right? Is libel, or you know, there are some countries that have like obscenity laws or things like that. Who gets to say what can move? And because at one end of the spectrum you have illegal stuff that people shouldn't be sharing, and at the other end of the spectrum you have freedom of speech, right? And how can you create a system that gives the controls to some people to kind of like deny things to be moved and at the same time protect freedom of speech, which is a critical component for a free society, right? You don't want to necessarily hand the keys of being able to like stop the flow of information to people who might just, who will, for example, try to take down videos of like a little girl singing happy birthday, which by the way recently passed copyright, right? So it's a tricky situation. And what IPFS does is say, the people that run an IPFS node decide. It is up to them to decide what they download and what they share. IPFS does not at all download content that you don't explicitly request. And depending on what routing, we call it a routing system, depending on what routing system you use, your privacy guarantees change. You basically get to dial between going really fast and completely private, like with Tor. So IPFS layers over regular local area networks, which are not privacy protecting, and layers, for example, over Tor. Additionally, because we already have received some DMCA complaints, we as the IPFS community, we act as a kind of like a funnel for the DMCA complaints, and we publish a list of the things that people should not share. And people subscribe to this list. IPFS people that run IPFS nodes subscribe to this list and don't reshare that material. But it basically puts them in power, right? It puts people in power to decide whether or not they subscribe to certain rules or not. And I think this is a critical part of the internet that should not change. This is what enables people to fight against bad regimes, for example. Think about Egypt. When Egypt shut down the internet access as a whole, that is a tricky situation that you don't want to accidentally build something into your transport system that allows powers to just take out their own people, right? We've actually had a fair amount of legal advice around this, and we've looked at a bunch of precedents and found a really good way to walk that line right in between protecting freedom of speech and complying with all the different jurisdictions. Because when you face it, different communities will have to deal with many different kinds of laws, and you want to let whoever runs that node to comply with whatever laws apply to them. There are lots of laws that people in the US will not follow that come from another country, right? Imagine if suddenly, just because one nation decided that certain material shouldn't be shared or certain history isn't true, now the rest of the world has to follow that, right? Like things, people in the US, for example, should not have to follow the right to be forgotten from Europe. And likewise, there are other things that people in Europe would not want to be censored by from the US, right? So that's kind of like how we think about this sort of thing. It is on a case-by-case or a region-by-region basis, and all these different lists of things not to distribute will be available, and we can help maintain those lists for people. I don't know, does that kind of make sense? And it's a very tricky thing.
Who creates the list?
So the people that create the list are agencies and so on that email us. We have the DMCA, for example, is I think one of the best systems around this. They have a very well-structured set of rules as to how you go about complying, and it involves having a form on a specific location that people can submit content to, and it has to follow a specific legal format. And if it doesn't follow that legal format, then it's not a valid takedown. And then you have a certain amount of time to comply with that. And within that time, we put it in a special list that people can choose to. Like people basically get a sense of saying, these are the things that have been DMCA takedown on IPFS. You, as an IPFS node maintainer, decide whether or not you follow that list. And automatically, the software that we ship follows these lists. But of course, there are opt-in and opt-out because they have to be.
If you run an IPFS node, that you can know the IP of the person running the node, right? So the DMCA can still.
That is. Yes and no. Again, it depends on the routing system. So for privacy's sake, again, when you think about the freedom of speech problem, you have to allow people to layer IPFS over Tor. And if you don't do that, then the security properties of the system just don't work. Because you need to be able to connect to the network and not reveal your IP address. But in that case, you trade off lots of security. But anyway, if you are interested in finding out a lot about this, we've written some documents about it. You can find it on our websites and on GitHub and so on. And if you have any concerns and so on, please reach out to us, because this is kind of new ground, and we want to find the best way to navigate all of these concerns and make sure that we come up with like a really good set of policies that make sense across regions, right? Yeah.
A cool related data point, when the decentralized DNS was being rolled out in the late 90s, they were actually getting lawsuits against them. The company running the DNS was getting lawsuits daily. But they actually did also find a middle ground that worked. So,
in terms of, can I add just in terms of copyright infringement, one of the things we thought about a lot is, what if, the blockchain is, if you use it for rights management, you want to use it for the fact that you have this like nice global database that's immutable, right? But now someone goes into the future and says, well, I made this song and I'm publishing it right now to the blockchain, and I made this and I'm not giving the proper owners the rights, right? And now someone comes and says, well, I'm making a derivative work and I'm using your base of it and also paying you for it, but they never made the original stuff, right? And that's definitely a problem. One of the ways, rather we see like two ways to get like a more pragmatic current solution out there, is that the artists themselves are responsible to also, until we can more properly automate it with things like tracking usage, is that the artist has to relay this information. If Taylor Swift on her Twitter says, this is my smart contract address, then that's pretty much her smart contract address. That's sort of the focal point that people will engage with. The other option is to potentially create incentivization schemes that people are not incentivized to infringe, right? So let's say you create a remix or a derivative work and you don't want to maybe infringe on using samples or things like that, or use it incorrectly. Hopefully we can also create incentivization schemes to be in line. But that's part of the difficult stuff we still need to properly figure out.
Yeah, I mean, just riffing on that, one really cool thing is that, a lot of ideas with respect to blockchain are sort of like flying in the face of the law. In the case of IP related to the blockchain, it's the blockchain is more like helping to buff up the law and so on. So with things like this, if you claim a work that isn't yours, that's fraud, right? And if there is an ownership dispute, ultimately you end up in a court of law and you talk about it. Now, of course, that's heavy and whatnot, so you want to try to find ways to reduce the friction in this, such as some of the methods you suggested. And there's actually quite a whole long list of ways. It's not cut and dry, it's not super easy, it takes effort. Things like going straight to the point of creation. Imagine take a photo with your smartphone and it automatically gets ascribed to the blockchain, right? That's a pretty good demonstration that you're actually the creator, right? If you have the proper crypto on the phone, a camera app, etc., right? But there is no perfect solution. It's just sort of a constellation of solutions.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, another problem that, a general problem encountered on the internet in terms of intellectual property or copyright is that oftentimes we encounter a lot of content and we actually have no idea who made it. We have no idea whether or not we're allowed to reuse it or not. So it seems to me that Ascribe could actually provide a solution to that in the terms of providing this global registry where people can go and find out information about the work. The problem is that, so the copyright registry at the time in which it was mandatory to register, at least in the US, to register the copyright, it was a mandatory thing. So you actually had this registry and you could keep track of who owns what, who is the copyright holder of which work. Now, the problem with a system which is not a mandatory system, like Ascribe, for instance, is that as soon as, if I'm transferring titles and I'm registering on Ascribe, then everyone can see who is the current owner. But then, if I don't actually have to record it on Ascribe, then I could also transfer the title in the copyright with a standard contract. And then, as soon as one person does that, then the chain of custody is broken. And then somehow this public registry, which actually is potentially extremely valuable, just doesn't serve a purpose anymore, right? So how can we actually start using things like this, but nonetheless allow for, like, recognize the fact that the real world still exists, and that probably most copyright licensing and assignment will not be registered on the blockchain.
Agreed. So like one cool thing, like I view, like I guess I mentioned before, the blockchain and machine learning and all this technology is sort of helping to buff up the existing legal framework. So you don't need a full registry of everything all at once. You can start with, like, we immediately gave value to the very first artist that registered on Ascribe in the blockchain, a year ago, right? He got value. And actually, in the world of art and many other things too, provenance, the history of ownership, really, really matters, right? So if you actually have a well-documented chain of ownership, provenance, then that actually makes a big difference to the value of the work, right? Examples, things like these Fabergé eggs, these eggs that golden eggs that were created in the time of Alexander the Great. One of them was found in a flea market a couple of years ago now, and the guy who found it, he didn't know it was an egg. He bought it for like $5,000. Thought he could, at the very worst, he could sell it for scrap metal. But then he actually went online and figured out what it was, and got experts to authenticate it, so up-authenticating after the fact, and sold it for, I think, about $30 million. So this is a case of actually recovering the provenance, right? But imagine if there's other ways to help nail down that chain of provenance the whole time, the whole way through. So towards your question, creators are and collectors are naturally incentivized to buff up that chain of ownership to use Ascribe this way, right? So, and this is what we're finding. We interact with artists who are selling works for $10,000, $100,000 at a crack, and it helps, right? Museums are collecting stuff that's ascribed, and they didn't. A lot of the time they didn't even collect digital art before, but now they can because they can claim the ownership, they have the provenance, etc. So it can be a one-at-a-time thing. It's not perfect. If someone wants to go off-chain, they can, right? They can still have legal contracts, etc. But there's sort of like built-in incentivization.
What if in Ascribe's case that someone loses the private keys and transfers to someone else? Now, can you reverse that? What recourse do you have in that scenario?
Yeah. So remember, the blockchain is simply a database of legal transactions that happen. The actual magic of the transfer is actually in the contract itself, right? And so the blockchain, et cetera, is just sort of proof that stuff happened. But if someone forges a document in some other way too, and in all these various ways, ultimately you end up in a court of law. You have an ownership dispute, and then the different parties related talk about it, right? So that's actually like it's a wonderful thing that you actually can end up. And it comes down to sort of like common sense from the jury or from the judge, right? So that's the recourse. Within the protocol itself that Ascribe has developed on top of the blockchain, it does offer alternatives like this where you can have sort of recourse and so on. We actually had to do this when people lose their password, right? When we first rolled out Ascribe, people would use us as the web app, and they'd be like, hey, they'd email us like, hey, I lost my password, and we're like, that's too bad, like it's blockchain, it's Bitcoin. But if you're using a web app, you just expect that if you lose the password, you have a recovery scheme, right? So we actually had to put stuff in there related to recovery, and we could get away with it because it's not tokens of value flowing through the blockchain. We use the blockchain as timestamping, and the actual value is in the contracts themselves that are good old dumb legal contracts, not smart contracts, good old dumb legal contracts.
One way to think about how this new world emerging can be is that what Ascribe is creating and what other people can help create is the graph or the network of ownership around content, right? When you create an entity, some piece of art or something, that is a node in a graph, and you, the creator, are another node in the graph that went into creating that object. But you might have actually collaborated with other people, so that might mean multiple nodes in the graph collaborating to create one piece of art. And that piece of art might have multiple editions, like limited editions, that are themselves specific nodes in this graph that get handed out to specific people through these certificates, all of which are nodes in this graph. And the interesting part about this whole network and graph, the reason why it's you can trust it is because you can use cryptographic properties to check the validity of these things. You can use a public-private key infrastructure to check all of those signatures and make sure that the thing is legit and it's real. And where the blockchain comes in, or where timestamping services as a whole come in, is that you can take these important operations and timestamp them into these systems to show a history and a record that's auditable from now on towards the future, right? So the people can come back and look at all of those moments of creation, of transfer, and so on. Like, I'm extremely interested. So I think like the patent ecosystem comes in here as well. So copyright is one side, and the patent ecosystem is another. I'm of the opinion that currently the patent system in software is pretty broken. Like it allows a lot of things that shouldn't be allowed as patents, and maybe excludes others that should be. And it's just like a very tricky situation where you have these massive companies amassing these huge portfolios, and only they can get to wield patents. So the little guys are kind of taken out, right? And something like this could come in and help, right? Because when you think about submitting patents right now to different offices, you have all these different processes depending on which country you're in, which may cost different amounts of money and so on. But if you can take the descriptions of your systems and timestamp them and sign them and so on, then at least you have the ability to claim proof that you did come up with something at a certain point in time. And as you go, you might actually create a graph of use of these patents and along these systems, right? You can think of a system as another node in this graph that is using a specific set of patents, each of which is a node in this graph. And those patents are used or created by specific authors in this graph. And you can trace back all the way, patent after patent after patent, person after person after person, the entire flow of information. And this is, I think, extremely interesting because it provides us the first case of being able to track invention along the way. And in fact, like, this is not new. I mean, maybe many people have thought about this and written about this for decades of being able to do this, but we finally have the tech necessary to carry this out in a reasonable and pragmatic way. We finally have the tools available to us to do this today. So this is why this is pretty exciting. So.
Okay, and as a last question before we actually turn to the question, so we've been talking until now about how the blockchain is actually supporting the current IP model. Now, the internet has actually shown that perhaps the IP model which was designed for the physical world might not be the most fit for the digital world. One thing that I find really interesting is actually, especially for Ascribe, so Ascribe is actually providing this possibility of reintroducing the notion of a copy, which means that we can now follow up the ownership of a digital copy in the same way as we can follow the ownership of a tangible copy, which has the really obvious advantage to reintroduce the doctrine of exhaustion and etc., and to like provide new business model, this thing. Now, I would like to think about what are the costs of this, in the sense that it also, the fact to be able to actually track every usage and to actually follow every single transfer of a copy, and actually the fact of reintroducing the notion of a copy in an environment of, in fact, things are non-rival and digital, doesn't it mean that we're actually reaching, or we're actually moving towards a system which is like a really like hardcore DRM-based system in which every usage is tracked, or to go with like the Imogen Heap application, in which like we get into this metered application where you just pay microtransaction for every consumption of a copy, whereas instead perhaps we should actually be looking at how the blockchain could leverage the fact that we now are in the digital environment, and perhaps we should design alternative business models which are not based on scarcity, exclusivity, but rather on like production, on virality, and actually maximizing consumption and rewarding artists, not because of like the exclusivity of copyright, but because actually there is a value in consuming, and because we can create like new crowdfunding models for artists to actually reward the production without actually limiting the consumption.
Yeah, so my general view is there's, you know, right now on the internet, the ways to monetize, there's like 2 or 3 different business models. You know, like the main one is advertising, which is terrible, and then the sort of the one that's coming online is sort of streaming. And you know, if you ask people in the music industry and otherwise, they're like, streaming is the future, streaming is the future. My view is there could be 100 different business models. ways to monetize, and it just needs to be easy to explore for entrepreneurs to explore. And right now, the problem is it's a high friction for an entrepreneur to explore it, because you have to go and take 6 months or a year and a half to go and get the licenses to just explore in the first place. And compare this to like the travel industry, where there's actually a global registry right now called Sabre, and startups can sit on top of the registry and start creating value for the consumers directly, immediately. So like things like Hipmunk and Kayak and Trivago and all these, they just plugged into a database. So they could explore different ways of monetization, et cetera. I think that's really healthy, right? So, and in Ascribe, we do support the idea of scarcity if you want. We also support the idea of non-scarcity, where you just simply license or have copies, right? Some artists we deal with actually, you know, they see that the number of copies is a proxy for value, right? And I love that, right? So you say, okay, great. Instead of just 10 copies, I see 10,000 copies. So that's great. I can monetize in various ways, right? One artist, he actually said the value of his work is going to be 10 times the number of Pinterest pins. And I think that's really fun. And then halfway through that project, before he sold it, he went and bought 5,000 Pinterest followers for like 20 bucks, just to kind of screw with the idea. And I love it. It's awesome. Like, artists are finding all these crazy ways of sort of playing with the system. You know, another company we deal with, Icono TV, they have millions of viewers, and they use Ascribe for helping the licensing part. And the key philosophy of Icono TV, Elizabeth Markovic, a well-known person in the art world, her view is it's actually all about distribution, right? It's all about getting art in front of people. It's not about limited copies at all. So I think, you know, the technologies of blockchain and making legals easy, et cetera, should go out of the way to support all these different varieties and let the exploration happen, rather than resort to ads. And on DRM too, I mean, I think, you know, traditional DRM with watermarks and encryption and all this, you know, that's been demonstrated to not work. And I hope it dies a painful death.
I completely agree. I think the most important part is to provide options, because that creates agency. You know, artists needs to be able to choose. If they want unique editions, then they can do that. Personally, I'm also a musician, and I'd feel like you are, as a creative person, you compete in the current attention economy, right? Which means you're competing with attention from social media, competing with attention from news and everything. The most important thing you need to do as a creative is get your work out there, and creating a barrier to entry to creating unique editions that you need to get from someone else is a limiting barrier to sharing your work. But it's up to the artists to decide. It's up to them, and we need to create the tools to let them experiment.
So another very interesting set of business models around art. So one of them is Patreon. So I don't know if you've seen Patreon, but it's a great website where artists can sign up and they get to create art through Patreon. And they have patrons subscribe to them and pay them a certain amount of money per month. And they just have to meet a certain amount of art created. Or I think it's not necessarily amount or just pieces or something. They come up with it on a case-by-case basis. But the idea is that artists can get to just work on their art, and the fans of those artists support their life through very small donations. And it's kind of like a contract, right? It's not just a free donation, here, have this money, and not do anything. It's rather, we are supporting your art, and thus you should explore it however you want, but we do want to see that art at some point. And it's worked fantastically. You can find tons of artists now that use this and make quite a bit of money, actually. There are some specific personalities there that are making more than great top-notch software engineers. And one software engineer was joking like, oh, I should quit this dead-end career as a software engineer and go become an artist. And when do you hear that, right? So this is a very interesting new time for art. And when you think about those patrons and that patronage model, when you become a patron, what happens to that idea, right? Perhaps you should be able to audit and look that you were part of helping create this art along the way, that you provided some amount of resources that in some way were transformed into art. Think about the Medicis, right? The Medicis became mostly famous not for their rule of Florence, but rather because they maintained all of these amazing artists. And that you see all these galleries of the Medicis because they were the ones that valued and priced art and allowed these artists to have the capacity to explore this art. So imagine being able to couple something like Patreon with this graph system with timestamping and so on, and being able to audit towards the future who were the patrons that believed in an artist early on and helped maintain that art. And then when you think about, there's a very interesting intersection with Kickstarter, right? A lot of art is now created through things like Kickstarter, where people are coming up with a plan for art, they tell the world about it, and they raise a certain amount of money. Then they go and produce this art. And this is already very successful. People have raised many, many millions of dollars. I don't know what the total figure is, but individual projects over, some of them I think over $5 million to produce art. And there's a very different model of funding movies and funding paintings and so on, play productions and whatnot. But when you think about it, the people that are contributing to these pieces of art are doing so because they believe in them and they want the end product. But there's another side of it. What if those artists then continue to go on and market this movie in some way and are able to make some money? Right now they technically don't do that because they don't know how the legality around that would work. Like, they took a bunch of money from people, created some art, made it Creative Commons, but they can't necessarily make money out of that, right? What if we had a different model that included something like Kickstarter, but when people are contributing to this art, they're able to get back a certain amount of the proceeds of all the art produced towards the future. They kind of become not necessarily artists, but backers of art in a way that you can trace back. And I think that we're going to start seeing companies pursue this kind of model over the next few years. And it's not clear how this is going to work out, and it's not clear yet how much great art will be produced or whether this is viable. But it's an extremely interesting moment to allow both the creators and the lovers of art to come together to create much, much more art and distribute it in different ways that just go direct from the artist to the consumer really quickly. So
this is a really interesting example also how there is really potential and new business model that can be done, but there is really heavy regulatory issue on how to actually achieve that.
Yeah, I have two questions for Trent and Ascribe. But first I want to say I'm a teacher of art students, and I think it's not only about the money and the funding, it's also about creating a user experience to help artists in the process of creativity. And I'd like to see a transformation into an internet of creators. So my first question for Trent is a simple one, and second is more complex. I read the Ascribe white paper, and you say that the two main weaknesses of the existing internet are that there's one-way instead of two-way hyperlinks, and that there's a missing layer of attribution for the digital art files. So what is the plan of Ascribe to go from being a registry of IP to then, when I do a Google search and I click on images, and that this would become a standard that I would see in a seamless user experience way, this attribution layer? That's, if you could just explain the nuts and bolts of that. My second question is, going back to the first thing that I said, if I could imagine a user experience not so much for IP of finished artworks, the product that's already ready to be copyrighted or patented, but a user experience to support the process of creativity, so that the potential artist wouldn't be so afraid to lose control of his work being put out there on the internet. So could we imagine like a kind of a multi-tiered structure, something like public, protected, and private, or something like nodes in the graph, where not the end result, but the promoting of creativity, so the artist could make public some aspects of his art project while keeping others private, which would be a complete alternative to advertising. So could Ascribe develop from the registry to the promotion of the Internet of Creators, but with a very practical, explicit model of the exposure through through a smart contract in which there were more options than the current IP laws are taking into account, and that would be Creative Commons 2.0.
Right, so to sort of summarize the questions, the first one is about, how do you recover attribution when you only have, within the World Wide Web, unidirectional links? And the second one about sort of, what about the history of creation itself as opposed to the final artifact outside of creation? So on the first part, and you gave the example of Google search. You do a Google image search or whatever, you get a bunch of results, and then it's like right-click copy, right? And there's no easy checkout. The analogy I'd like to use is, it's like, imagine you go into a supermarket and you find an apple, and you want to buy that apple. You go to the checkout, but there's no checkout. So you're like, okay, whatever, I guess I'll walk outside with the apple. And then you walk down the street, and this 300-pound security guard comes and tackles you and says, "That's $100 for the apple, please," right? You're like, okay, right? And that's actually exactly what happens with takedowns and all this. There's actually a lot of companies that make a living from takedowns like this. And it kind of sucks, right? So this is related to the sort of the UX for IP is broken. And interestingly, in the design of the World Wide Web, there actually was precedence. The original conceptualization of hypertext in the 60s from Ted Nelson, actually, he thought about this. And he said, you know what, I'm going to have bidirectional links. And he created this Xanadu system that had it, right, as a way to have sort of built-in attribution and so on. And he also actually had built-in copyright, which is kind of amazing. So going back to the 60s, the sort of built-in copyright, built-in attribution. And he's still spending time on building the system. It's 50 years in, right? And Tim Berners-Lee actually referenced the Xanadu project when he built the World Wide Web. The challenge is the system was so complicated that it was really hard to roll out, right? Ted Nelson even started a company in the 80s to do this. It got bought by Autodesk, the makers of AutoCAD, and they were rolling it out, and it just, it was coming along, chugging along, and then World Wide Web came along and just took off because it was just ridiculously simple, right? And but it left behind attribution, right?
He theorized a trans-cultural space.
Yeah, yeah. So which is really awesome, right? The challenge is, sometimes simpler technologies just take off just because, it's easier to deploy, et cetera. And so Ascribe's view is, I love the vision of Ted Nelson and Xanadu. I love the idea that you have attribution sort of somehow, right? And I love the idea that you make copyright easy. But the engineering design has to be in a way that reconciles with the web of today and the web we want for tomorrow, or the internet more broadly. And so Ascribe's approach is simply to do it retroactively, and that's exactly by crawling the web, right? So crawling the web and identifying where that shows up. So that's a way of sort of synthesizing after the fact that link that goes the other direction, right? And so that's our way of realizing that part of Ted Nelson's vision, the attribution. The other part of the vision, which is he had the built-in copyright. Our sort of after the fact way of doing it, sort of retrofitting towards what exists in reality now is simply to make the licensing really easy, right? And with respect to, you mentioned Creative Commons and all this, the licensing can be also just declaring what you're giving away for free to the world, right? This is free if you attribute me, all this, right? So we actually iterate with different Creative Commons organizations on that because it's important, and it's important to the web, et cetera. So towards your second question, which is to recover once again, it's the questions of what about recording the deltas of creation, right? And this goes back to your talk on Providence. And overall, there's sort of this graph of three things. There's the history of ownership and loans and all this sort of thing, which is sort of like the traditional idea of Providence, but there's this richer idea. There's the copies, the history of sharing, and there's also the history of creation. So in Ascribe's view, what we want to have is every single point of creation tool out there in the world that creators use. We don't want to build these ourselves. I want, when I'm using Photoshop, save and ascribe, or I want it just to happen automatically. I want plugins in browsers such that when you tweet, it gets ascribed, right? And we're actually doing this in various ways already, right? So, CAD companies we talk to where they're like automatically just built in, instead of just like saving to Git, code versioning, it's actually doing that plus onto the blockchain, right? So, And this actually resolves the problem of authentication of the binding between the creator and the work. You have much more proof that you created it if you actually have the steps along the way recorded, right? And that actually kind of helps everyone. So overall, you know, like we started with Ascribe with a starting point, right? Really focusing on the sort of end artifact, and then we've tacked on the sort of the history of sharing, but we're working towards also the history of creation itself. And these three things together create this graph. And there's relations, right? Because you can have derivative works and so on and so forth. So all three parts of this graph really matter.
I'm really glad that you mentioned Ted Nelson and Ted Nelson's vision, and that helps you drive you, because it is fantastic. So if you're excited about blockchains, if you're excited about the web, and you don't know about Xanadu, like, go read about Ted Nelson's vision and Xanadu. It's a fountain of amazing ideas. Some viable at the time, some not viable, some viable now, and some which have yet to become viable. And so it's an interesting fountain of ideas for today as well. I'm sure that you can find a bunch of other interesting conceptions of how content gets created and how content gets represented and moved around this network that might seed the next thing. So it's a valuable body of work to explore and understand. And Ted is around. Ted goes and hangs out at places like the Internet Archive and so on. And I think he still answers some email. Don't email him a lot. Don't swarm him. His time is really valuable. So just do read his work and read his thoughts and hear what he has to say. And take into account that he came up with all of this stuff in the 60s, 3 decades before the World Wide Web began. And I think what Trent said makes a lot of sense. There's a certain set of engineering constraints around the almost like physics of how this information flow actually works that yields a preference for certain kinds of solutions, right? So one-way linking is way easier to think about and create than two-way linking. And this is why the World Wide, or one of the reasons why the web, as Tim Berners-Lee made it, was so much more easy to roll out and create, especially at the time. But now we get to think through and say, well, what is the web that we want to exist that we can create on top of the engineering solution, right? There's the base, which is the engineering solution, and then there's the abstract notion of what we want to create on top of that. And that is where we can have two-way linking. And that is where we can create ways of attributing information and all this kind of stuff in this graph. I do want to mention one other piece of work which is relevant to think in terms of all of this, and that is, I think it's Simon Kirby's documentary called Everything is a Remix. And it is fantastic characterization of how all of the copyright system today works and what is broken about it, what is really good, and is trying to sort of make sense of the development of the clash of cultures between how art gets created and how copyright was originally instilled into the world, and how all of these information technologies change that world and what happens then. And it's a very good source of inspiration around really thinking how to reconcile these two worlds, and really thinking how to reconcile our desires for the art world and what we want, what will best benefit all of the art creators and distributors and so on, and all the people that are maintaining this really valuable piece of humanity, while at the same time making it make sense with all of what we want out of information, out of how freedom of speech works, out of how information distribution works, and information use, and idea derivation, and so on. Okay, great. So I'll wrap up, and I think another question.
Yeah, so we tried to screen the movie The Rise and Rise of Bitcoin here in Hong Kong. And to do that legally, we have to go to a UK company that is a rights distributor. We have to send them a wire transfer of 200 pounds, which cost us about 40 pounds in fees, of which I think the maker of the movie get about 30 to 50 pounds, just to get a physical piece of paper that we can then show to the movie theater. But to make Bitcoin a solution here, or to make the blockchain a solution here, we need to, the rights are being inscribed on the blockchain. We then need to convince the movie theater that these rights are sufficient in proving that we have this license to show this movie once or twice in Hong Kong. And then, which I don't think we would be able to do. And then the movie theater would need to go to the government and convince them that this is actually a legal showing and not like a pirated showing. So we seem to have created these huge institutions that make this change very difficult, and it also serve to protect themselves and protect these old interests. Maybe very quickly, so that Finna doesn't get too mad at me or you. How do you think will this play out? Like, because you cannot do both. You cannot put it on the blockchain and put it in the other systems. How do you think we will overcome these institutions, or even make it possible for artists to put movies on the blockchain or rent them out?
I think it will just, one of the unfortunate answers to this, I think it just will take time for people to accept this is actually a legitimate way to do it as well. I think if we provide the opportunity for artists to put the stuff there, the demand from the other side will also come, right? Well, hopefully. One of the examples that I think would be awesome to see was just by the fact that we have a more public registry for IP, is that, you know, you have this example of a fan that makes a music video and they want to license a song. That fan has absolutely no idea who to call up, right, to get the license to use a song in a music video. So just by the fact that we could potentially have a more public database for these things could hopefully mean that, you know, if there's a groundswell from independent artists using these things, then more and more people can then eventually go to the governments and theaters and say, look, this is actually a legitimate way of doing things. It's like, you know, when you first had to prove to a visa application that Airbnb is a legitimate like use of, you know, where you're staying. It's the same. It just takes time to eventually get there.
I have a quick answer. Yeah, my view is actually there should be no convincing necessary, because it's the law, and you're just using the existing law. You're using licensing contracts, etc. So it's there. Now, actually, what would be amazing is if over time laws changed where you could just do it more purely on the blockchain or app blockchain. That's going to be fantastic. But we don't have to wait for that to happen. We can actually just help to, what you described is just basically a high friction process, right? With the paying, with the licensing, all that. If you remove that friction in the process, then it becomes a lot easier. And you know, you can pay with Bitcoin. You know, we have people selling art for Bitcoin, and then they get the rights, you know, ascribed in the blockchain, etc. So there's actually a two-way transfer leveraging Bitcoin both ways. But to me, like, the laws are already there. We just have to make them easier to access. And as time goes on, we can improve the laws.
When you think about it, Creative Commons is, I think, one of the best examples of how to go about demystifying the law and creating great education around what it takes to actually license your work and so on, right? Imagine the world pre-Creative Commons. If you made something and put it online, how would you go about licensing it and so on? The information sources were just not very good, not available. It took a lot of effort to try and figure out how to license work. Creative Commons not only introduced a set of licenses, but also education around the entire legal landscape here. And so what we need to do, coupled with new ideas and new tech, we need to do an enormous amount of education of people in general, both users of art and creators of art, as to what are the alternatives. I bet tons of artists don't actually know that all that really counts is just a set of contracts, and that they don't actually need some of these larger, enormous organizations that will probably squeeze out a lot of profits, right? When you think about, so I have several friends in the music industry, and one of them talks about how they just became independent, and they're actually making way more money, and they actually have more distribution through things like online media and Spotify and so on, and it ends up being that they have more people actually listening to their work, which is counterintuitive when you think about the old models. But the only way that you get more artists thinking about this is if you do a whole bunch of education around it. And what's going to happen is that the established companies will get better. What will happen is that they'll realize that you know, there's certain things that the landscape has changed to some degree, and they just need to get better, and they will. I think like the good ones will, as usual. When you think about you know, sort of music pre-iTunes and now post-iTunes, you can get a lot of music legally online, and people just got better about how to do all the licensing.
And just to conclude, I will also say that one of the big friction is actually like all the steps and all the middlemen that are involved between like the public paying and the artist receiving, which is actually a really small fraction of what the public has paid. With the blockchain, you can actually design much more optimized system. You can have direct payment, and most importantly, you can also design like decentralized collective societies in order to actually redistribute the proceedings of like whatever the public is paying in an actual direct way without having like the collecting society that is taking like the big percentage of what the public is paying for.
Great, thank you. Can we thank our panelists for just a fantastic session? Smart contracts on pillar IP system. Gentlemen, thank you.